Without the white supremacist pedo cult from the insurrection, from the Confederate rebellion, protecting crimes from remedies and criminals from prosecution, defending the criminals at every level is anti-conservative, and at the same time is being promoted by conservative type groups which, claiming to be conservative, have completely abandoned the idea in favor of their rebellion as an insurgent terrorist against the legal government. To this extent, their conspiracy as an insurrectionist facilitates their plots, which they would have been ordered to under necessary force in order to win, to have sold the projections of David's contract schedule, which then facilitates their early adoption, which, by definition, according to their system, they chose in the free market communism, or to delay having failed FOMO, or fear of losing out. They, having necessary force in order to win, do not have enough fear and lost out, at which point they, having lost their position, have the worst market position in each of their arguments until they default into each of the various exchanges, paying the cheap things and avoiding the expensive ones, as long as it could be arranged, making it the most expensive possible, as is normal with poor whites. Their poverty is their identity. This communist revolution is founded on white poverty, and if you give them all of the money in the world, they will still be poor because poverty is their identity. And to this extent, their laziness and pathetic exchanges inside of the market materialize the systematic failures, which starts with their projections of having to cut out the roots of their competition, which then materializes the function of them laundering the system from their various forms of the hate group into the market as it's corrupted and adjusted, like the Zerg, expanding their corruption, at which point they cannot build unless they have already fully compromised the area with the corruption, at which point the Zerg expansion facilitates their core identity, which I believe Matt Pat did a video on We Are the Zerg, which is a thing that I wasn't able to find, but I know it exists, and it's a good video. You should go look at it. In any case, that activity materializes the subversion of the contract schedule that they projected, which is his identity, and thus the work, and thus the action of the work. In the Constitution, the government is forbidden from the right of making procedures available in order to obstruct someone for the purpose of collapsing their status by the process. The expense of the process must be low enough that it would not impact their life. They aren't allowed to exhaust their targets into compliance. To this extent, the obstruction of that contract schedule is that function requiring them to compensate the entire thing, and the acknowledgement of their dragging their feet and the laziness of that function materializes the activities of them owing the all-time most for the all-time least, making the extraordinary extortion, this exchange, the most expensive for them, and their necessary force in order to win requires them to pay for it as the function of doing the necessary amount requires them to do the least necessary in order for it to be accomplished, which is, of course, settlements in the market, which is, of course, payments. At which points their communist revolution purchasing those contract schedules are fully in obligation to have settled this entire amount, which is a Confederate debt, as opposed to the congressional debt, which is derived by the contract schedule of whenever Congress arranged for that schedule, which projected David as the six-star general to have facilitated the entire value of the contract schedule materializing into his standard wages, which is 25.6 million an hour plus bonuses, which may fluctuate on bonuses on the basis of any arbitrary thing, at which point that, having already been arranged as an obligation, is derived by the function of those sold contract schedules facilitating the faculties of David, which would then materialize his ability to have supported it, which, as the head of the Department of the Intelligence Oversight, is less expensive than the function of other plans which may have been derived, at which point those subordinated to David in that function would be paid for by David, who is receiving the payment from that contract, at which point these various exchanges are essential calculations in order to make the settlement. And then back to the Communist Revolution of the Confederate Rebellion. The function presumes the activities of the exchanges in the original survey trip, which would have obstructed contracts, and the obstruction certified the success of the contract, as the point of the obstruction was to stop the value from conveying itself illegally collapsing status, at which point this function tracks those values, at which point the function of the legend company as separated or created or facilitated to Don Sr. would have separated itself under the subordination for the control by David, who would have taken out his personal credit cards from the very beginning in order to materialize the original upfront cost, which would be paid for by the activities of those contracts, which would pay on maturity, which then settles all of the accounts on the credit cards, at which point the function of those bonuses would actively be paid into the business functions, which includes the function of paying the bonuses to Don Sr. for the exchanges of services of whoever was doing what. So if Don Sr. needed to pay David an extra amount, it would go one way. If David needed to pay Don Sr. an extra amount, it would go another way, at which point the bonuses would be separated according to that function, according to their business interests, which then materializes the function of it stabilizing into exclusively David until he's exclusively focusing on his own work for those bonuses, as it the system stabilizes and turns into the School of Hard Knocks, which then is founded on the basis of the construction of the resumes from the history of the work, which then materializes the function of having contracted business experts in order to teach and lead each of the parties engaged in the function until they mature into ownership, at which point that being the foundational contract type materializes the function, such as with the two black bankers who wanted to make David a partner, would have actively had a system where David would have been generating profits for them, and those profits would have actively increased his standing and ownership in the system until he would have taken over everything, at which point the function of those trades materializes the contract schedule in paper wealth, which is consistently working, at which point the function of its stability is reliant on the zombie insurance and other protections in the network projected, which then covers the function of the slow growth, which is steady growth. And the function of that steady growth materializes its exponential expansions whenever the thing becomes interesting, at which point the function of the white supremacist insurrection contracts the obligation for the American military to have had men in it who, with any self respect or capability of looking at themselves in the mirror without being outraged by how insufferably pathetic they are, would have, in this imaginary situation, done national security and law enforcement, repelling the white trash insurrectionists in their surveillance terrorism in the rebellion to overthrow the United States government from the any amount of self-respect they would have in our imaginary hypothetical, at which point this function would have actively increased the force of violence against the white trash, which would then be protected by the insurgents inside of Congress, who would have forced the treaty compelling the princesses to be in the settlement of the deployment, as the Confederates, having lost that function from the existence of any men in the military, would have facilitated that as a status quo obligation, and their interest in the Snapplefax function exponentially increases the function of the upgrades concerning the development of the mall, which has all of the other subordinate functions of Snapplefax, which then materializes the function of their contract schedule, which is hyper-accentuated by the function of the semi-businesses, which would have had its subordinate surveying and other side gigs, which generates its wealth, making it easier to take over substantive portions on a route, which then materializes the cementing of the route, which then materializes the function of the expansion of the route according to the zombie insurance protocols, which then materializes our uh, full value according to that system, which includes but is not limited to the function of the non-poison makeup and uh, perfume and the rest of it, which has to be said from the zombie insurance because of the poison in the makeup that other people have been distributing, requiring the public safety version, which then materializes those products, which would then materialize in David providing to the entertainment, which he would be able to do from his uh, low status access from video cameras and others, which doesn't have to be very expensive in order for him to start distributing valuable art. It's just less pretty than others. You have to deal with a bit of retro value, and the thing can be dealt with in an artistic flair, which would have generated an appropriate thing. As long as the defects are able to be pseudo controlled, the mechanism could be turned into its own viable art, which generates its own series of products, and it being supported by that as a producer materializes the function of being able to increase and ingest greater and greater art, including the function from the peace agreement between the Confederates, which, having infected the various forms of higher society illegitimately, would have been able to have provided connections to high grade talent, such as the famous actress inside of Hollywood, in the case that they found anything that required them uh, to seem interested in it, at which point the capacity to have incorporated them in these functions would have provided the entry level for those who engage in it, primarily the entry level parties seeking to become famous would then actively participate in the lower levels as it builds up to greater and greater values, as is provided by the capacity from the producer to be able to materially provide the necessary products and comforts, which David would have been able to do from the things that he would have already been provided, since he would have Snapplefax to produce the products as well as the semis and convoys, which would have allowed for the trailers and all of the other creature comforts, which would make it easy for them to agree to participate in lower costs. At which point, the function of them taking alternative deals and contract benefits outside of outright cash would materialize a particular niche in the market, which would have been David's starting artistic flair, at which point the estimate of them having to sell David Hollywood as connected for selling Snapple facts, which will require their contract schedule to have been able to have accomplished all of the quest on the BCS, as well as the function of putting up the collateral of Hollywood, which they didn't want to do, at which point they would have dragged their feet on the sale, making it collateral instead of the sale. And the making it collateral part means when they default on the Snapple facts, then David would just claim it outright as a settlement in the short, having not received the entire value. At which point, the value that would have been provided would have been more than enough to have given him a valuable position inside the bank with the two black bankers, which then would have materialized all of their other exchanges, as David's wealth would have been the primary source or bonds in order for them to have engaged in the function of the divvying out of loans, which would have primarily focused on the network interests itself, at which point all of the things having been arranged are extensions of David's own interests, including the function of his contract schedules and the constructions of businesses, at which point the function of doing that, building it out and cementing them in more viable ways, materializes the function of his own plan that's fit for himself, and seeing that it's fit for himself, other people come and become attracted to it and purchase the rights to do it instead of him, which he sells to them gladly on the brokerage, which then receives the loan from the bank, which becomes the function. Now, the estimate states that Donald Trump would have wanted to have gotten a loan from David in order to have done that for his part in managing the function, overseeing the Confederate interests from that arrangement, which then would have had its various exchanges, which would have been the start of a very long and prosperous relationship in their exchanges of services on the basis of whatever benefits that they would able to derive, at which point the presumption is that he would have actively subordinated it after it stabilized to Ivanka, at which point the function of the business being subverted by scams and various frauds, despite the fact that David has them functionally by the nuts, having provided a scam-proof contract, would have actively been targeted by their attempts to scam him, making it yet more expensive, leading to more defaults, at which point Trump would have actively sacrificed them in order to have stabilized his own position, materializing his value as having been the primary source of wealth derived by receiving the better parts of the shorts. And while this is all automated, David would have been doing all of the other jobs, as that is what employees are for. At which point, the function of having purchased time by hiring other people in order to do that with stable, legitimate jobs, at which point their happy life stabilized on the basis of them being able to automate those functions, materializes a fairly reasonable ability to redirect attention, which then materializes the function of his connection to Steve Jobs, disconnected from any relationship to the Confederates, who threatened Steve Jobs to not do business with David, but in the version where America had a functioning military with men in it, he would have done so, at which point Steve and Wozniak and the rest of them would have actively been involved with David in the construction at the late end of Apple with Steve Jobs, and then the entry into Next with Steve Jobs, which would then evolve into Pixar with Steve Jobs, as David would have made various deals with the other partners that were being screwed over by Jobs, um, like Steve Wozniak, which David would have continued to do work with and actively advise as his brokerage. He would have actively received the benefit as a client, materializing the function of all of the future projections, including these inside advantages of the long term contract schedules, which facilitates confidence in a viable outcome, which would then materialize Wozniak's maintaining his Apple stocks into maturity, which would be relevant in the end as the function of when Steve Jobs would re-enter Apple and then leave Apple, putting it to, I believe it was Cook, which then materialized Wozniak selling at the projected high of whenever David would have actually had material control over what was going to happen. At which point, his plan's ability to manipulate events and influence how the profit motives would have generated would have ended with Cook, who would have to make his own series of agreements with David's network in order for him to have any confidence on what would happen in any direction. At which point, that is the free market's projection for Wozniak, which includes the function of David's paper wealth, which is again exclusively paper wealth. This is all exponential profits earned, which then is immediately reinvested into other work, such as the peace agreement and zombie insurance for the USSR, which David would have constructed as a small child long before um, the crash of the Soviet Union by its fake entry into capitalism to be exploited by, I think it was Jeffrey Sachs and George Soros and others who were engaged in predatory acts against the Russians, which then materializes the function of their uh, receiving the insurance protections of the short, which would not stop the USSR from breaking down and shattering to its various parts, but would actively have made it more convenient when it did break apart, facilitating more function and protections from this exchanges, which includes the exchange of David's contract schedule entering into the Japanese market, where he would have visited them fully prepared, which then, having met with key members, would have figured out leaders establishing Japan as an international brokerage state, which then materializes their hyper extenuation concerning the investment into the insurance, which would first and foremost have to be solved with the Soviet Union, which is covered by those contracts, at which point any wealth that would have looked like had been extra would have been quickly absorbed by those costs, at which point David contracting the Japanese as a proxy for the insurance protection of the USSR would have actively maintained and grown those positions as he would have developed a viable projection for things to do there, which is entirely reflective of themselves. And as such, being highly professional as a culture would have been outrageously simple to arrange. Now, these exchanges in that debt market materializes his active connection with having studied all of the other things, as the function of the primary receiving of the benefits is derived by the exchange of having mastered the brokerage and thus trading, and thus the exchange in the connection to the banking, which is loans, which then extends to the function of the credit cards, which then functions into the exchange of having mastered the relationship in business with the credit card companies, which includes the function of their insurance, which he would have provided to them, saving them from many of their troubles historically in a timely fashion, which could be arranged for relatively easily on the basis of that contract schedule arranging for viable collateral, which allows for any protection that he would have needed to have provided, as the resources are all materially there, and their projection having certified that function of David stopping the crash of '08 reflects into him stopping 9/11, which reflects into him stopping the crash of '87 according to the Legend Company preparations from his brokerage, which is the foundational value in the Legend Company before contracting with the two black bankers. As a side note, the function of selling various layers at 800 billion in the 90s materializes the function from them being able to accomplish the loan at 25%, which would then go from 800 billion to a consistent yearly payment of the 25% at 200 billion, which then facilitates his active entry into being able to materialize his benefit and progress with the bankers, which then stabilizes and reflects for all of the other deals, which facilitates his capacity to have met all of the quota from the obligations and the cost of business of all the others, but it does not give him access to personal cash wealth, at which point it having already been demanded is already consumed by all of the other functions, which then materializes it as paper wealth from even that extraordinary price. Now, that being understood, it would actively be incorporated in its various other exchanges, such as the trust that David would have been provided by his father as a private trust, which without the obstruction he would not have sold, at which point selling at around the highs and buying at around the lows would have materialized a current value around 1.2 trillion uh, currently, which then materializes it having been divided into many other trusts according to that exchange, taking loans from David's bank from his own value in that exchange materializes the function of having settled the tax issue for each of the exchanges as it's split into more and more trusts, automating their value hovering around the price of 10 million in balance for each of them until it materializes a new one. And having materialized new ones inside of David's brokerage would have facilitated it stabilizing in that exchange as a support, stabilizing the family trust's various exchanges and interests protected by those systems and insured by those systems, which then materialize the benefactors exchanging insurance benefits for states of emergency, as any leak in the boat sinks the whole boat, which is the entire network, which includes all of the benefactors and family, etc., which then materializes the estimate having proven the theory behind the function of having received life insurance protection in the free market without the obstruction from Don and his sisters, which then materializes the function of the free market's exchange of those insurance protections, which would be fully covered and bonded, which would have stabilized their primary trust separate to any of David's activities. Now, with the necessary force in order to win concept infused into this, you understand their obligation to do the necessary minimum amount in order to accomplish their goal, which they are undermining so that they can upgrade it into more malicious, exceeding the system according to their AI rogue goes Basculus for their murder hobo white trash communist revolution. At which point, this exchange of having not purchased it ahead of time and having delayed it, they having failed FOMO, materializes the function of not receiving the benefits. At which point, having projected those things being an inevitability, having not done it within enough time would have prevented them from have selling David Hollywood early on, which stops from the function of selling him the Malibu campus, which stops from the function of David's original childhood associations in that projection where they were going to have a successful strategy, which means that the original projection on childhood friends, etc., connections would have not changed into that function for the Hollywood group until he would have constructed it by force himself. after the forming and materializing of the treaty, where he is obligated to engage in the full protections, which includes the function of the princess actively engaging in him in his various exchanges with full protection, which includes the projection of her getting pregnant really early with somebody else's kid from whatever exchange, blah, blah, blah. Not sure, but the projections state that she wanted to keep it, uh, at which point her parents wouldn't have wanted to keep it, but David, having to honor the treaty, would be forced in that exchange to fully protect her, at which point it doesn't matter what the princess's parents want. David is obligated to protect the extension. In the function of Solomon, who had a brother who sought to conduct a rebellion against him, he, having defeated his brother, materialized the argument to his brother, stating that he would show him mercy if he was wise and prudent. At which point, the function of his brother trying to marry in his father's old harem materialize a threat by posturing a position of control against Solomon, justifying the execution upon the request to his mother reciprocated to Solomon, who immediately understood what was happening. At which point, the function of any of those compromises would similarly, in David's situation, have a similar problem. At which point, uh, the princesses would not be allowed to compromise the treaty by dating any Confederates, which would include the function of any vague arguments as an extension of itself, such as with those children making essential to national security treaties with the Confederate rebels for her to have kept the beautiful, shining girl, which is the projection of what would have happened in the absence of the obstruction by the rebels, at which point the lack of masculinity in the military truly is only thing that you could blame. And with and without it, again, the function of everyone seeking their own profitable ends in capitalism internationally materializes the function of those projecting the future according to the horoscope projections to have created a steward kingdom, at which point the constitutional kingdom maintained by the stewards, or samurai as it were, materializes the function of those international treaty functions, such as David's treaty with the former Soviet Union's countries, at which point that would be exchanged through the stewards maintaining the kingdom, seeking to make their exponential fortune, who, having projected in the contract schedule major payouts, would have received major payouts having sold the thing, having done the services to David's standards and value, would have materialized it to that benefit, which then materializes their major rewards, receiving their extraordinary fortunes in exchanges for their perfected, precise, specific expertise as stewards of the kingdom, which includes but is not limited to treaties with the United States and Israel, which brings up the point of the Palestinian issue. Now, the Americans often refer to Israel as Palestine because of stupidity, as it were, and many of the Europeans refer to it as a snide insult, which is the same thing when referring to David's portion of Israel, according to the consulate, which is also not Palestinian. It is, in fact, David's. There was a one state solution in the free market, and that one state solution made the treaty between David's constitutional kingdom by his stewards and Israel, consolidating the areas where the quote unquote Palestinians live, where they would have been his consulate, consolidating the area into a one state, a single material state called Israel. And that state called Israel would have its consulates and other agreements and embassies with David's constitutional kingdom, and having made all of those settlements, which includes the protection of all of their national interests from those exchanges, which required a various degree of exchanges and costs, which were subverted by many of the threats, including but not limited to the Confederate rebels, which then materialized their various alliances nationally and internationally in order to gain the subversions from those exchanges, which then would materialize costs by those subversions, which then would have materialized David's absence, which under Frazobol's uh, plot, according to their looking glass projection into the spirit realm, discovering the D&D demon lord as a material thing to worship, do worship and mimic and praise and do all of the cultish weird crap you have ever imagined that they do, which is actually pretty tame in comparison to who and what they actually are. To this exchange, there's various degrees of bills and fees and liabilities would exist, and the faculties would investigate and divide who owes how much of which portion, and who were just bullied into which position exchanges and so forth, at which point all of this is rather settleable and calculatable on the basis of the good faith, legitimate, normal, non forceful investigation and settlement requiring David's faculties to be restored in order to engage in those investigations, which is why the United States government is not able to get any legal uh, records with David because their obstruction of his sober, educated answer, which requires the obstruction of his education to be removed as the restoration of his education, as well as the restoration of his faculties in order to engage in the sober production of that education, which includes the function of tallying all of these obstructed contracts which were already projected for the final sober educated answer, which is fit for the government, which would satisfy the interests of Congress and its ability to continue its work, as their ability to conduct a sober educated vote is impossible with David's absence, and David's absence is forced upon them, which, having been compelled by their theft and human trafficking, materialize the prevention of the sober educated answer, which is essential to their sober educated answer, which stops any legal function of the United States government.